Hello everyone and welcome to episode 9. In today's episode, it is time to take a look into databases. Now this is something we've also done in season 1, but in season 1 we made quite a lot of vital errors, and in the meantime there have come up a lot of new updates which we have to take into account. Now because databases are just something that are complex, we will have to split up this episode in some parts. Now, it is one video, but in the description down below, you'll find various timestamps, so that if you just want to catch a break or you want to switch and do something else, you can nicely drop off once you've finished the part and later on continue. This also allows you to skip to a certain part if you've already done it. For instance, if you already have something that we've used installed, you can just skip ahead. Now first, what we'll take a look into is what are we going to use. Then we're going to install what we're going to use. We're going to update our configuration file so we can connect to our database or have some values in there stored allowing us to connect to our database. We will set up a database context and database context factory, which I'll explain later. We'll create a model, so something where we can define in what we're going to store in our database. We're going to create our very first migration, which will tell our database to, hey, you need to add this and this to the database. We will then create our data access layer, which will allow us to interact with the data. And finally, we will do some cool dependency injection stuff. Now, all these parts will have their own timestamps down in the description below. First off, what are we going to use? In this episode, we are going to use MySQL as our database together with Entity Framework Core. Now, MySQL is just one of these so many versions of SQL. You can use a different database, but in this video I will show you how you can simply install MySQL and put it to use. Now I also mentioned Entity Framework Core because we're not just gonna write some SQL queries as they're called, but we're gonna let Link take care of that for us. You'll see exactly how that works later in the episode. Now first off, we'll need to install MySQL. For that, we will go to dev.mysql.com, which will be in the description down below. Here, we press on MySQL Downloads, and we press on the MySQL installer for Windows. This installer allows us to download every single component that we need. Now, whichever one you pick is up to you, but in this video, we will stick with the MSI installer that's not the web version, so the normal version, which is 470 megabytes. Press the download button, which will ask you to log in or sign up, but you can also just press no thanks, just start my download. That way you don't have to create an account for Oracle, but you can simply just download whatever you want to download. And once that's done, you can just open it up. Give it administrative permissions, and wait a few seconds so it gets everything up and running. Once that's done, you'll get a few options as per which installation we would like to use. Because we're just going to be using the developer edition, we want to go for developer default and press next. Here, you'll now see a list of items that will be installed. Once you're ready to install all of these items, you can just simply press execute, which will start installing all of those items. Once the setup is finished, you press next, where we can now configure some items of this installation. Now here you can define some changes. We just want to have the development computer configuration type that will just set everything up for us. Now as the authentication mode, we want to set use strong password encryption for authentication. Now we can set the password of our root user. It is very important that in production environments, you set this to something secure. As soon as this password is compromised, anyone can access any of your data within your database. Since we are in a development environment, having complex passwords is something that's only going to hold us back. So, in our case, because we're developing and not using this on a server for future use, we can just type in a very simple password, something like QWERTY. Once you've set your password, you can also add extra users, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to use the root account. Then press next, and here it'll ask you if you want to set it up as a Windows service and if your server should start up as soon as your system starts up. Now, because you don't notice anything of MySQL running, I would highly recommend you to have these two checked, which are checked on default. This allows MySQL to just start up once your computer starts up, and that as soon as you start up, for instance, Visual Studio and want to use your database, your service will be running and thus your database will be reachable. Now press next and press execute, which will configure everything that we will need. Now that this is done, and we press here next, and we press finish, and we press next again, and now we type in our credentials, and press check, and then next, and finally press execute. We are now almost done with the configuration. If we press next again, you'll see that we now are done with the installation. We can choose to decide Workbench and Shell after setup, but this is not needed. Let's just uncheck them and press finish. Now you get a nice overview of all the products that have been installed. And you may ask, do I really need every single one of these? And the answer is simply no. But because we're developing, and for instance for future use, you might need one of these products, they're nice to haves, but you only really need the MySQL server. If you want to, you can press remove and remove the other components. But for now, we're just going to press yes, and then just close this. Now that we've done this, we can move on to the next part, which is updating our configuration to have some connection string to our database in it. For this, we open up Visual Studio. We select our project, and we go to our configuration file. Now in this configuration file, we want to add a value that will allow our bot to connect to our database, which is a so-called connection string. To do this, we add a comma at the end so that we can add some more configuration values, and we start off by using a value that Visual Studio suggests us, connection strings. This value can be used to provide multiple connection strings. For instance, you could provide here one for your development server, and you could provide one for your production server. That way, once you make something for your production server, you could easily switch by just saying production instead of development. And connection strings is a value supported by our configuration. For instance, if we look at our command handler, you know that we have our configuration injected in here, so we can access the configuration anywhere we like. If we now say underscore configuration dot get connection string, you'll see that this gives us a method, allowing us to get one of our connection strings. Let's go to our app settings and just type in one called default. Now it is time to provide our connection string. The first value that you want to have in your connection string is the server, which is the host. So where is my database? Here we will need to type in the IP of your database. Because we're running our database locally, we can just type in localhost. Now, which database within our database are we going to use? And that sounds complex because sometimes we mix them up a bit. But what we've just installed is a database server. And in a database server, we can have multiple databases. That way you don't have to have tens of instances of MySQL running. You can just have one running multiple databases. Now the database that we want to use is database equals watermelon, which is a database that hasn't been created yet, but we will create in a second. Next up is which user do we want to use to connect? And that's the root user, the user that we've just made by installing MySQL. Then, what is the password of that user? Which is what we just configured, QWERTY, or something that you've changed it to. Now that we're done with this, we can move on to the next part, which is installing our required packages. But before doing so, there's something important that we have to talk about. Discord.NET and Entity Framework Core, which are two libraries that we will be using, have a little bit of conflicting going on. For instance, if you were to just put Entity Framework Core in your normal project, which in my case is just Watermelon, there's going to be a lot of conflicts. There are some turnarounds for this, but sadly none work really well or make anything any better. Best workaround that I have learned is to just put everything database related in a separate project, which in general is quite a good practice to do. Put things that are quite different in separate projects. For instance, if you will build a API on top of your bot so that you can let users interact with your bot, for instance, from a website, then you'd have a separate project for that, not in just a separate folder. So what we will do is we will right-click our solution, press Add, and press a new project. In here, we can select all kinds of projects, but what we are looking for is class library. Make sure that it has this green C# logo and it just says class library. Then you can press next, and we're going to call this watermelon.data. Then we press next again, and now we can pick the target framework. In here, you want to make sure that you have the latest version, so .NET 5.0, and then press create. This will create a new project in which we can put everything database related in. Now, also make sure that your Watermelon project, if you right click it and go to properties, has target framework .NET 5.0, which is the latest version of .NET at the time of recording. Now save all your changes and you can close this and this file. Now it is time to install some of the libraries that we've been talking about. Go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. We will be looking for Entity Framework Core. Select the first one that appears, Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, with almost 300 million downloads, and make sure that you pick the latest stable version. Now today, version 6 was released, but because this is a very new version, I suggest that first we stick with the latest version of version 5. This also allows you to, if you're using this video in the future, that you can still follow everything that's happening in here. If there are major changes with version 6, you can head to the Discord server where there will probably be a tag explaining what you will have to change for version 6. But for now, let's stick with the latest version, the latest stable version of version 5, which is 5.0.12. Press the data project and hit install. Press I accept. And now what we want to search for is MySQL. So Entity Framework Core MySQL. This will give us Pomelo's Entity Framework Core.MySQL, which is a library that will allow us to connect Entity Framework Core to MySQL. Entity Framework Core is a so-called object relation mapper, and it means that it allows us to interact with data a lot more easily than separate queries, as we call them. But it is not just for MySQL. In fact, it works with a lot of SQL versions, such as SQL Server, as Azure SQL Server, SQLite, Azure Cosmos DB, MySQL, PostgreSQL, and many other databases. Now, to properly support MySQL, we need this library. So select it, make sure that you have the latest stable version of 5, and then press install. Press I accept. And now we also want to install a library that will allow us to configure MySQL. Now an explanation about that will be given later, but for now we want to look into Microsoft extensions.configuration. Now from this library, we will need 3. First, the base one with about 850 million downloads. And again, make sure that you pick the latest stable version of version 5. Make sure you have the data project selected and hit install. Then we also want to have Microsoft.extensions configuration binder. Again, ensure that you have the latest version of version 5, hit install. And finally, we want to make sure that we have extensions configuration JSON, and then make sure you have version 5 and hit install. Now, those are the libraries that we will need for now. Now what we want to do is create our so-called database context. Our database context is basically a class that will say, hey, our database has a table containing this type of things and this type of things, and also this kind of things. To do that, we will create a separate folder in our watermelon.data project by right-clicking it, pressing add, and pressing new folder. In here, we will just call it context. We'll create a new class within it by right-clicking it, add, and press class. Then we will call this our watermelon DbContext. Now, because this class is going to contain a so-called database context, we need to let it inherit from DbContext, which is something that we have to add a using statement for. So hover over it, press the light bulb, and say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Then we want to make this class public. Now we're going to create a constructor for it. But instead of passing all the configuration values in here, we're going to let the configuration values be passed along. We can do this by using the so-called base constructor. We do this because later on in our program.cs, we will dependency inject this database context and there pass the configuration. That way, we don't need to separately have some values set here, because that'd be very confusing and not something we want to have. We just want to have one central point, preferably program.cs, that configures everything for us. That way, if we have a change to our database or it's moved to a different server, we just have to change one file, appsettings.json, not also some lines in watermelon DbContext. To do this, we want to create the constructor. We can simply type ctor and pressing tab twice, which will create the boilerplate of the constructor for us. Now, because we want the database context options to be passed, we'll provide an argument here, DbContext options, and call it options. Now, because we're not going to define them in here, we want to let that be done by our program, CS. So we'll do a colon base options. That way, the options will be passed through our program.cs. We can get rid of the line that we have over here, and we can now say like, hey, our database is going to contain this and this and this. But before doing so, we have to take a look into a database context factory. This sounds very good, because now we can just pass the configuration through our program.cs and everything is taken care of for us. The problem, however, is that in order to, for instance, push changes of our database context, so what we have right here, we have to run our watermelon.data project or use that project without using our Discord bot, because they're separate now. And because they're separate, we will also have to give this project its separate configuration file and a way that, for instance, for migrations, which I will explain in a bit, that those can just work without us having to still provide some options in here. And to do so, we can create a database context factory. We right-click our context folder, press add, and press class, and in here, we now type watermelon DbContext factory. We want to make this class public, and we want to let it inherit from iDesign time DbContext factory with the generic type parameter of watermelon DbContext. Now this requires again a using statement. Hover over it, press the light bulb and say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core.design. Now that all sounds very complex, and I understand, but this will allow us to run migrations in a bit without having any issues. Now we need to add a method for this, which we can do by hovering over iDesign time DbContext factory, pressing the light bulb and say implement interface. This will give us this method over here. And in here, the first thing that we want to do is get our configuration file. So we'll say var configuration equals a new configuration builder, like it is, which will need a using statement. So hover over it, press the light bulb, press using Microsoft extensions of configuration. Then we want to set the base path, which is something we've done previously. And we want to set that to directory.get current directory, which is something that we'll need system.io for. So let's add that using statement like this. Then we want to add the JSON file, app settings.json, and we want to have optional set to false and reload on change to true. And finally, we build this configuration builder so we get a nice configuration back. Now we can create an options builder. We store this in a variable, so let's call this var options builder equals a new database context options builder, like this, which will need another using statement. So let's hover over it, press using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now we say use MySQL like this, and then we want to pass in our connection string. So we'll say configuration dot get connection string like this, and then default. Now we need to provide a MySQL server version. So we'll say new MySQL server version, and then new version. Now we need to provide the version of our server. How do we know which version our server has? Well, if we search up from MySQL, you'll see the version actually at the download file, 8.0.27. So 8.0.27, just like that. Add a semicolon at the end. And finally, we want to say return new watermelon DbContext with options builder dot options. Now things may get a bit clearer. I'll give it a try one more time. We now have two projects, our bot project, Watermelon, and our database project, watermelon.data. Now in our data project, in a minute, we will create so-called migrations, which will tell our database, hey, we want to add this table containing these columns. But because we do that just by using watermelon.data, Entity Framework Core will be like, hey, aren't you supposed to pass a configuration because you're doing this? And then we'll be like, hey, no, you can use our context factory like this, which will pass a configuration for you. That way, if we do pass our options like this, then it will just work perfectly fine. If not, then it will fall back to this and then try again. Hopefully that makes a bit more sense. Now that we've done this, we can start creating our very first model. Let's right-click our project, press add and press folder. And now we want to create a new folder called models. In this folder, we will store our so-called models, which in databases will be tables. We right-click our folder, press add and press class. And now we can add our very first model, which we will make a guild, which is a keyword for server in Discord. Now we're creating a guild as our very first model because this will allow us to, for instance, have customizable prefixes per server, which are pretty neat, right? So what we can now do is say, okay, well, if we have a guild, what do we want to store in our database? First off, of course, we want to have an ID so that we know, hey, this guild is associated with this record in our database. So we'll say public ulong ID, and then we want to provide a getter and setter, just like that. Make sure you also make the guild class public. And as our second, well, so-called column, we'll add a public string prefix, which will be the prefix of our server. Now we can go back to our database context, and we now want to add a table of these guilds to our database so that later on we can add new guilds to our database, or we can get rid of them, etc. We can do this by saying public dbset, so another word for table, and then what type of table do we want to have? And that's going to be guild, like this. And then what is the name of this table going to be? Guilds. And again, we want to provide a getter and setter. Now guild will require the using statement of the models folder, like this, and then it's all set. Now, to let these changes take effect, what we want to do is we want to go ahead And first check, what are our errors? So let's filter out the errors and of course get rid of this nice little error that we've made here. And now we can get rid of this class that we have over here in our data project. Now it is time to create our very first migration. Now what are migrations? I've mentioned them before, but basically migrations will tell our database, hey, we need this table that contains these columns that have this type. Let's create our very first one for the changes that we've just made. So let's set our watermelon.data project as our startup project, which is very important. And then we can go to our package manager console. Now in here, you want to make sure that you set your default project to the data project as well, like this. Now, before we can run any commands, we want to make sure that we install one more library that will allow us to run commands in this package manager console. For this, we go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. We're now going to search for Entity Framework Core.tools. And then we want to have the first one. Make sure you select the latest stable version of version 5, so 5.0.12, and press install. Now press I accept. And once that's done installing, we can close this tab, go to our package manager console, and run add-migration initial migration. Now, when you run this for the first time, you may get a warning. Exception has been thrown by the target of an invocation, and generally speaking, these errors are not very clear. But this time we're lucky. As you can see, it says the configuration file appsettings.json was not found and it's not optional. The physical path is in a certain path. That is because it's trying to see this appsettings.json file over here, but it's not in our folder. Therefore, what we want to do is you want to right-click your solution and say Open Folder in File Explorer. Now, you want to open your Watermelon folder, copy your appsettings.json file, and paste it in your watermelon.data folder or your project.data folder, and press paste. Now, if we go down and try to run this command again, you'll see that it now succeeds. And what you can see here is kind of the things that it will do. It creates a table that has 2 columns, one an ID, prefix, and it creates some other cool things. Now, for these changes to actually take effect, what we want to do is run update-database, which will push our migrations to our database. Now, how do we know if this went successfully? How can we see our changes? In the description down below, I will leave a link to something called DbSQL, which is one of my favorite tools to quickly access SQL databases and see what's in them and edit them. This is the tool right over here. Now what you want to do is just fill in a new record and then fill in the hostname IP as localhost, the user as root, and the password as whatever password you set during the installation, and then you can press open. Now in here, you'll see a lot of databases, but the one that we're looking for is the one that we made for our project. In my case, Watermelon. That is because Watermelon is the name that I provided all the way back in our appsettings.json file over here. The cool thing is that even though our database didn't contain that Watermelon database, Entity Framework Core just made it for us. And then it also added our table, so our DB set of guilds, and all of the columns that we added to it, so the ID and the prefix. And now that's done, it is time to create our data access layer. To do this, we will now close DbSQL and we can right-click our project watermelon.data. Then we press add and we press class. Now what we're going to do is we are going to create our data access layer. The data access layer, or DAL, is a class containing all the methods that interact with your database. So to get all the data, to create some data, to adjust data, or to delete data. Basically, CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. So let's create a few methods that will allow us to, for instance, create a new guild, set a prefix for that guild, and get the prefix of that guild, and also to delete that guild. First off, let's create the class. So let's call it data access layer, like this. Now in this class, let's make it public. And then within, we want to create the constructor. So ctor and press tab twice. Now what we want to inject is a DbContext, so DbContext factory. And then between arrows, we put the watermelon DbContext. Now we'll need a few using statements, so let's add those by pressing Ctrl period or hovering over it and pressing the light bulb, and then adding the using statements that we need. And then let's name this the context factory. Now the nice thing is, to let Visual Studio take care of everything, we can hover over context factory, and then we can go to the light bulb over here and say create and assign field context factory, like this. And now, due to conventions, we want to add a underscore in front of this. We get rid of this over here and place an underscore, just like that. Now you may ask, why do we use this DbContext factory? And the reason behind it is quite simple. We don't want to care, for instance, whether our data access layer is used within a service, so a class that is, well, initiated once and then runs for the lifetime of our bot, or if it is initiated within a module, which is refreshed every single version. Now, the two key differences is that within a module, every time a command is ran, it will create a new instance of our module and thus the class. So say we were to inject our data access layer within a module, then every single time that data access layer would be the newest version, containing the newest relevant data, etc. But if we were then to use that data access layer in our services, for instance our command handler, that would still be the old database context. Therefore, to make everything a bit easier, what we want to do is let the getting this new database context, so the watermelon DB context that we have over here, we want that to be handled by our data access layer and not our module or our services. This way, we prevent all the errors that we've seen in Season 1, such as a second operation started on this context before a previous operation completed. All those errors are avoided because we just get a fresh instance from the DbContext factory. Let me show you how that works. First off, let's create a method that allows us to create a new database. So public async task, and then we just call this create guild. For that, the only thing that we need is the ID of the guild, and then we add some nice brackets. Now, before we continue, it is also a good idea to go to your guild model and add a default value for the prefix. That way, for instance, if we create a guild, we will only need the ID and a prefix will already be set on default. An easy way to do this is just by saying equals a string and then put a prefix that you like over here. So for instance, we will use a exclamation mark, very original, like that. And now prefix will always have a default value of exclamation mark. Now, if we go back to the data access layer, we can now put this context factory to use. So in order to get our own database context, we want to use a using var context equals underscore context factory dot create DbContext, which will give us a fresh instance of our database context. And because we're using a using statement, it will take care of everything when it comes down to disposing, so that we won't get any problems with, for instance, memory. Now, what we of course want to check is, does this record already exist in our database? And if that's the case, then we can just skip. So what we'll do is we'll say if, and then context, dot guilds dot any, so we're going to use system link, and then x dot id equals id, we just return. Simply what we're saying is, okay, we have this guilds, a collection of guilds, and then we use system link to say, okay, if any of my guilds have an ID that equals the ID that was passed, then we just want to return, do nothing. Now, if that's not the case, then what we want to do is say context. So we have our database context dot add to create something. And then we just simply say new guild, which is our model that we made previously. And then we want to add a using statement. So hover over it, press the light bulb and say using watermelon data models. Then we use curly brackets, and then we say ID equals ID. Very simple. And now the final thing, to save these changes, we just say await context.save changes async. So we get a fresh instance of our context. We then check within that context, are there any servers with this set ID? If that's the case, return. If it's not the case, then add a new guild to my context and save the changes. Now I want to have a method that gives me my prefix. So how do I do that? Now, to get the prefix, we'll create a public string and then get prefix and then ulong ID for the guild ID. We open up with curly brackets, and again, we have this line using var context equals the context that we create the database context, and we'll repeat this for every single method when we need the context. And then what we can say is, okay, return context dot guilds, and then we go for a new line, and then we say first, for default, x dot id equals our ID, and then the prefix, and then we end with a semicolon. So now we have two methods, one to create a guild, one to get the prefix, and let's create two more. So one to update the prefix and one to delete the guild. So we'll create another method, public async task, and we're going to now create the method that allows us to update the prefix. So we'll say public async task set prefix, then we provide the ID of the guild and a string for the new prefix. Now again, we can repeat these three lines. So we create our context, we check if the guild exists. If it doesn't exist, we don't want to do anything. But here you kind of have to ask yourself a important question, because say your bot was, for instance, restarting while it was added to a different server. Probably you then did not run this method because it missed it. And then they try to change their prefix. Now, what do you do? Because this will just return because it cannot find any guilds that were stored because your bot was offline, but it is in that server. And if this is not going to work, then that's going to be a problem. For that reason, it is important that, for instance, you also check, okay, if this is the case, then I do this. If it's not the case, then I do that. So let's change this up a little bit. Instead of doing it like that, what we'll do is we'll say var guild equals, and then we're going to say await context dot guilds, and then dot find async, and then the ID. Now find async allows us to search based upon the primary key. If we look in DSQL, you'll see this yellow icon, and that means that this column is the primary ID, and that is the ID of the guild. So we're going to search based upon this ID, and then we'll get something back. Now say that guild does not exist. So if the guild does not exist, then we want to create it. But before doing so, we want to first check if it does exist. So if the guild does exist, so if it's not null, then we can just say, okay, change the prefix of this guild to my new prefix. So guild.prefix equals prefix. And if that's not the case, so if it does not exist, then we want to kind of do the same as that we did here. So we can copy line 27, add a else over here, and paste that what we just copied. And then at the end, we want to add prefix equals our prefix. And then finally, we just say await context.save changes async. So we get a fresh instance of our database context. We search for our guild in the database. Does it exist? Then we just simply change the prefix. Does it not exist? Then we add it, including the prefix. And then we save our changes. Now this is also smart to do in our getPrefix method. So what we can just do is copy these lines over here, go replace them with these lines, and instead of using find async, we're just going to use the synchronous method like this. So context.guilds.find and then the ID. Now, if it is null, then we want to create it and save the changes. If it is not null, then we just simply want to return the prefix. Because that's the case and we don't really need this if-else statement, we can just say if the guild is null, then we can copy this line and paste it over here. And we can cut this line and paste it over here, and we can get rid of the else. So if it is null, we want to add it to our context, and then we want to set the prefix as our default prefix. Now, because we have that defined in our guild model, we don't need to add it at all over here. What we can do is just say, okay, guild equals this, and then at the end, we say .entity, which will give us our entity of the guild. If you hover over it, you can see it's the guild. Now, instead of using await context.save changes async, we get rid of that, and then we get rid of async and just save it synchronously. Now at the end, when we're done, we can just say return guild.prefix. Now, how does this work? We first get our, of course, a fresh instance of our database. Then we search for our guild. Now, if the guild does not exist, what we say is, okay, create me a new guild, and then set this guild variable that we have over here with that guild that I just created. Now, why we do that is because if we go to our guild model, we have this prefix defined here. So instead of just saying that again, we can just use it by using entity and then save the changes and finally return whatever the prefix is, whether that's the default one or a custom one. Now, the final thing that we want to do is create a method that allows us to delete the guild. So we'll say public async task delete guild based upon the ulong ID. And for this, we can again copy a few lines. What we'll do is we can copy this, paste it over here, so get a new instance. But instead of checking if our guild exists, we want to make sure does it not exist. So if it's not already there, then we want to return. So if context.guilds.all and then the ID does not equal our ID, so if none of the guilds that exist have our ID, then we want to return. Now, if that's not the case, we'll say context.remove and then context.guilds.find and then the ID of the guild like this. And finally, we'll say await context.save changes async. Now, a different way of doing this could be to say, okay, first search this guild like this. Then if the guild equals null, just return. And then instead of doing this, we can just say guild. You can do this either way, but we'll stick with this one for now. Now we have 4 methods: create guild, get prefix, set the prefix, and delete guild. Now the final part that we want to do now is arrange our dependency injections, and then we can put this to use in, for instance, our modules. So let's go to our program.cs, and at the end over here, what we want to do is we want to nicely add a database context factory and our data access layer. We'll start off with this database context factory. We do this by saying .add DbContext factory. And for this one, we will first need to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for a solution, and install Entity Framework Core for our project. So we'll search for Entity Framework Core like this. Press the first result. Make sure you're on the latest stable version of version 5. Press the watermelon project and hit install. Now we can go back to our program.cs, and you'll see now that it recognizes it. Now, as a generic type parameter, we want to add our watermelon DbContext. And to do that, we need to add a reference from our bot project to our data project. So right click your bot project, press add, press project reference, select the data project and press OK. Now hover over Watermelon DbContext, press the light bulb and say using watermelon data.context. Now we want to open this up and add a lambda expression by saying options equals and an arrow to the right, and then options dot use MySQL. Now to put that to use, we'll hover over it, press the light bulb and say using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Now in here, we'll have to provide our connection string. So we'll say context dot configuration dot get connection string, and then the default one. So like this, like we've done previously. Make sure you also add a parentheses after that, and then we will have to provide the server version. So we'll say new MySQL server version, and again, that will be the same version as in our database context factory. So if we go back here, we can just copy this over here, go back to our program.cs, and just paste that in here. Now hover over version and make sure that you're using system, and then to get rid of this warning, we can just press this and say move argument to a new line. Then add a tab at the start of here. And finally, we can add our data access layer. We do this by saying dot add singleton, and then between these two arrows, we're going to provide the type parameter, and that's going to be data access layer, because that's the class that we want to use. Again, this will need another using statement, so hover over it, press the light bulb and say using watermelon.data, add the parentheses, and finally you can end with a semicolon. Now you may still have some warnings which are related to our style cop. Just fix those by fixing the spacing. And now we are all set. Now we can really put that implementation of our own custom module base to use. Let's take a look into it. Let's go to our Watermelon module base. And now what we want to do in here is we want to create a constructor. So we'll say ctor and press tab twice, which will give us a nice constructor like this. And then what we want to have here is our data access layer. So we'll add data access layer, like this. We want to add the using statement, so hover over it, press the light bulb and say using watermelon.data. And now we want to add this as a field. So hover over it, go to the light bulb over here, create and assign field data access layer. Now we want to make this a public read-only data access layer, and then we want to capitalize or Pascal case the name of it. Just like this. Now we make this public because in the future, our classes will inherit from it and then put it to use. So what we should do here is press the light bulb, say suppress or configure issues. And the one that we want to suppress is, if we hover back over it, we can see here, field should be private, which is SA1401. So SA1401 is the one that we want to suppress. And we do this by saying in suppression file, and we go here and explain, okay, why? And then we can just say, hey, field will be used by inherited classes. Now we can go back to our Watermelon module base, and we want to add the documentation for the constructor. So we'll press this, generate constructor documentation, and then we can say here, DESC data access layer to inject. And as the summary of here, we can say DESC data access layer of Watermelon. Now, this is everything that we need in order to access the methods in our data access layer. If we now go to our general module, we will start to get an error, which is over here. It says there's no argument given that corresponds to the required form of blah, blah, blah. And that's because our constructor is no longer working as it should. That is because now we will want to inject our data access layer in here by using the base constructor. So after our IHTTP client factory, we add the data access layer, and then we go to a new line, use a colon, base, and then data access layer, which allows us to nicely pass it all through. So we want to add a parameter for that. So we'll add this by saying param name equals data access layer, and then we can say DCData access layer of watermelon, or DC data access layer to be used to match this parameter over here. Now we don't need to add an extra something like data access layer equals data access layer. That's not something we have to do because that's already done within our ModuleBase over here. So now if we go to general, let's put this to use by just creating a command that allows us to get or set the prefix. So we'll create a new command and we'll call this prefix. Then we'll say public async task prefix async, and we'll have a optional argument of a prefix. So string prefix equals null. So it's optional. Let's open that up. And now the first thing that we'll do is create something if you did not provide a prefix. So if prefix is null, we'll say await reply async, and then we want to add a $sign at the start, and we'll say the prefix of this guild is brackets, and we'll say current prefix, which is something that we will make, and a period and a semicolon at the end. Now what we'll do is to get the current prefix, we'll say var current prefix equals data access layer dot get prefix and then context guild ID. So what we just did is we said, okay, we want to access our data access layer. We want to run the method get prefix, which is what we created previously. And we passed in the ID of the guild like this. And then we can just mention it like that. And finally, we want to return. And then what we can now do is run whatever we want to run when they adjust the prefix. You want to make sure that you have some checks in here. For instance, you probably want to check, isn't this way too long? Is it not something weird? All those checks are up to you. For now, I'll just simply say, okay, I want to adjust the prefix. So what I'll do is await data access layer dot set prefix. Then we need the ID of the guild. So context guild ID. And we want to add the prefix. So prefix. And finally, we'll say await reply async $sign at the start. The prefix has been set to, and then prefix. And a semicolon at the end. Let's give it a try. Now, before doing so, let's make sure that we switch to the Watermelon project as our startup project. So right click it, set as startup project, and then run the code. Now, let's head over to Discord and run our prefix command. As you can see, the prefix of this guild is exclamation mark. Now, if we provide a new prefix, so prefix and then something like W exclamation mark, you'll see the prefix has been set to W exclamation mark. And now if you run the prefix command again, you'll see, hey, the prefix of this guild is W exclamation mark. Now you may say, hey, but didn't you just use the prefix exclamation mark to even get to know what the new prefix was? Yes, it's true, because we didn't add anything yet that will allow our command handler to know, hey, that prefix is something else. So let's create that. Let's close our console, go to Visual Studio, and go to our command handler. Now, like we did with modules, we can also create our own, for instance, service. So we have this initialized service over here. What we can simply do is create something that allows us to, for instance, have a custom implementation of that. Now, before doing so, it is important that we update to the new version of Discord.addons.hosting. So let's go to Tools, let's go to NuGet Package Manager, manage NuGet packages for solution, and this only applies to the people that, for instance, in their command handler, so over here, still have initialized service. If that is the case, then you want to go to NuGet Package Manager, you want to go to Updates, and then you want to go to Discord Add-ons Hosting, select it, and make sure that you have the latest stable version, and then hit Install. Press I accept. Now, you may get an error when you're trying to update this all the way down saying, hey, detected package downgrade, something, something, something. That's because discord.addons.hosting actually contains all of the other packages as well. So go to installed, and one by one, uninstall the discord.mat packages. Now that we've done that, let's give it another shot. So select your project, select the latest stable version, and press install. Press I accept. And now the latest version has been installed. Now let's take a look at our command handler. As you can see, now we get a warning. Now we get this warning because in the newer versions of discord.addons.hosting, we have to change things up a little bit. And here we can immediately start putting to use what we've done with our custom module base as well. Make a custom version of initialized service, or in the newer versions, Discord client service. To do so, right click our services folder, press add and press class. And in here, we will create a watermelon service. So we're going to let our other services inherit from this service. Now first we make this class public like this. And then in here, we let this inherit from our Discord client service, like this. Now we want to create the base constructor, or the constructor of our class. We can do so by just going in here, typing in ctor and pressing tab twice, and then we get some of our dependency injections. Now the first one that we want to have is our Discord socket client, so that we can access the client in any of our services. The second one that we want to have is a logger, so that we can log things to the console. So we'll do ilogger and then Discord client service. It's going to be the logger. We also want our configuration, so we can, for instance, grab some configuration values if we need them in the future. So iConfiguration, configuration. And finally, we also want to be able to access our data access layer. So we'll say data access layer, like this. Now let's add all the using statements that we need. So hover over each warning that you get or error that you get and add the using statements that they need. And now we want to assign all of these to a field. So we hover over here, go to the left side and say create and assign field client, like this. We do the same for our logger. We do the same for our configuration. And we do the same for our data access layer. Now, because we're going to make all of these public like this, we want to start them with an uppercase. So client with an uppercase, logger with the uppercase, configuration with an uppercase, and data access layer with the uppercase. Then we need to also change it over here. So let's fix these injections. And even then you'll still notice, hey, there's still an error going on. What's going on? That's because we have not yet called our class abstract. So now if we change our class to abstract, that will get rid of one warning. And then we have another one, which is here. There's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter client. That's because we have to pass our client and the logger via the base constructor. Why do we need to do so? If we go to the definition of Discord client service by pressing F12, you see that it takes a client and the logger. So we will always have to pass that through. The same goes, for instance, if we look in general, you see, hey, we always need to pass that data access layer via our base constructor. That's because if you go to the definition of watermelon module base, the constructor takes that data access layer. So we always need to pass it through via the base constructor. So what we'll have to do here, if we look at Discord client service, we'll have to pass the client and the logger. So we go to Watermelon service, add our base constructor, and what do we pass? The client and the logger, like this, which will solve all of the errors that we just had. Now, let's get rid of all the unnecessary using statements and nicely reorder them so that they appear within the namespace. And then, of course, we also want to document some things. So we'll start off here by saying a custom implementation of C Discord client service for Watermelon, like that. And then we can document each one of these. I'm going to skip this for now, but it is advised that you do that as well, and also for the constructor over here. Now, once that's done, we can go back to our command handler over here. And now, instead of letting it inherit from initialized service, we're going to let it inherit from Watermelon service, like this. Now, we'll instantly have a few issues. So let's see the first one. The first one is that it does not implement the abstract member of execute async. How do we fix that? Well, that's quite simple. First off, what we want to do is we want to add the base constructor. And what do we need to pass? Let's take a look at our Watermelon service. It will need the client, the logger, configuration, and data access layer. So we go to our command handler, and to the base constructor, we pass our client, the logger, the configuration, and the data access layer. Now we don't have the logger and the data access layer yet, as you can see. So let's add those to the constructor by saying logger Discord client service, and then the logger and data access layer like this, and then add the using statement for our data access layer like this. And make sure you properly type data access layer over here, and then all the issues are resolved. Now, the next change within Discord add-ons hosting the newest version is that initialize async is no longer initialize async, but execute async like this. And you also want to make sure that it's not public, but a protected override async task, execute async. Once you've made these changes, all of these errors should be gone. So let's filter out the ones that we now need, and then go to our program.cs, which is where we will find our last error. Now, in configure Discord host, we no longer need to provide this generic type parameter. We can just get rid of it, and now we can just configure it like this, and that will work perfectly fine. Now, all of our issues have been resolved. This allows us to finally create something that will allow us to read the prefix of a certain guild, and then check, hey, does our message start with that very prefix? How do we do this? Very simple. We can just say, hey, var, and then prefix equals data access layer dot get prefix, and then we'll need the ID of the guild. Now, how do we do this? Is by getting the user of this socket message, the author of it, as a socket guild user, and then using that to access the guild, and using that to access the ID. So what we'll do is we'll say var user equals, and then message dot author as socket guild user. Now we can just say user dot guild dot ID, which will give us the prefix, and then we can replace this configuration prefix with just simply prefix. Let's give it a shot. Let's run our bot. Let's head over to Discord. And now let's run our prefix command with using our new prefix. So W exclamation mark. And as you can see, now it actually works. And if we now try to use exclamation mark prefix, it no longer works. If we again use this command and use exclamation mark like this, it works perfectly fine. And now if you use prefix, it works again perfectly fine. It nicely changes it. It reads the latest prefix, and voila, it all works very well. Now, let's talk about a few best practices. Say you were to, for instance, create a help command, and you wanted to have that help command display the prefix. Now, what you could do, for instance, is indeed just create a variable within every single method that would need to have your prefix, or you could, of course, also add this to your custom module base now. Let's show you how that works. So this will be, for instance, my prefix. So I want to have a public string prefix, right? Now what we could do is say, okay, well, we want to have a custom way of getting this. Now there's two ways of doing this. You could do this via property, so just by using something like prefix, which will allow you to call it as if it was the data access layer, and then you can just use like prefix, like context, or you could use a method. Now usually properties should not be used to, well, be a method, like to actually run operations. They should just simply be something containing something that already should be ready to be used. It should not really do something, but you can also just use it for that purpose. You can also create a method and do exactly the same that we will be doing right now, or you can just use it as a property. Now what we'll do is we will also create a private string, which is going to be underscore prefix. Now we do this so that we have a kind of small cache containing the prefix that, for instance, we already got while the command was executing. So that way, every single time you want to call prefix, it doesn't have to keep getting that from the database. It can just give you that one that it already has cached. Now, this won't do much when you, for instance, run two commands and it has no effects. But say you have the help command and you want to have your prefix displayed in a simple way so that you don't have to, for instance, store it in a separate variable, or that you don't have to constantly call, hey, get my prefix, you can just use this property. And we want to do that efficiently so that not every single time you call this property in your command, it's going to get it from the database again. So to do that, what you can do is you can say, okay, get, and then what we're going to do, so we are going to set the getter now. What happens when someone tries to access this property? Now, if my string is null or empty and an underscore prefix, which means that previously we haven't stored the prefix yet, then underscore prefix should be data access layer dot get prefix and then context guild ID. Now we can access the context because we're inheriting from ModuleBase. Now what we can do is we can say, okay, when that's done, we just simply return underscore prefix. Now when we look at here, it says braces should not be omitted. So let's comply with that by saying rep with braces like this. So what happens now is every single time someone tries to get the prefix, it says, okay, did we already previously get this prefix while we were trying to run this command, which it does by checking this. If it hasn't, so if the string is empty, it will say, okay, the prefix will be this, and finally it will return that prefix. So this prefix will always be there. Now, if we go to our general module, instead of saying var current prefix and this and that, we can get rid of this, and we can just say, hey, the prefix of this guild is prefix. Now, let's run that. So let's say prefix now. And as you can see, the prefix of this guild is exclamation mark. Now we can also again say prefix W exclamation mark, and then try to run W exclamation mark prefix. And as you can see, this works perfectly fine. So it's a small little best practice that you can use as well. Now, of course, this doesn't have to go via properties. You could also go to your watermelon module base and still have this private field, but then just create a method that says get prefix. Now, I hope that was all clear for today. That was a lot of explaining and it was a very long video, but I hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel more than free to join our support server. And before we end the video, I want to say a quick thank you to 09, Narajas Velucas, Andy, Kerpaki, Nicholas, VoxMM, Aki26 Gameplay, Code, and Madaleaf. Have a nice day. Bye bye.